The rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the 43rd floor, each drop a metronome counting down to something inevitable. Darius Holloway sat alone in his mahogany-paneled office, the kind of space that spoke of decades rather than years, salt and pepper beard catching the dim light from the desk lamp. At 56, he'd learned that a man's life could be measured in moments. The day he's born, the day he falls in love, the day he realizes the person he loved never existed at all. The divorce petition lay before him, third reading in as many hours, 25 years reduced to legal boilerplate and demands that read like a shopping list. His phone buzzed. Lionel Garrett, senior partner, voice carrying that particular weariness reserved for conversations about the end of things. "D, you sure about this? Going nuclear?" The answer came without hesitation, words measured and cold as January rain. "She took 25 years, I'm just taking back what's mine." The line went silent for a beat, then Lionel's exhale carried weight. "Court's in 4 days. Everything's ready." Darius ended the call and turned to the window, watching Atlanta's lights blur through the downpour. Somewhere out there, Celeste was probably celebrating, convinced she'd already won. The thought didn't anger him anymore. It simply existed, a fact as immutable as the rain. 26 years earlier, the rain had been different. Summer warm, Memphis heat turning the asphalt into a steam bath. 4th of July weekend, 1998, and the Blues Festival had drawn crowds that spilled across Tom Lee Park like a living organism, pulsing to the rhythm of guitars and harmonicas that understood loss in a language older than words. Darius Holloway had been 30 then, fresh off 8 years as a Navy JAG officer. The kind of lawyer who'd seen the inside of courts-martial and diplomatic incidents that never made the papers. Honorable discharge papers still crisp in his desk drawer. He'd come to Memphis to study for the Georgia bar exam, renting a room in his cousin's house for $300 a month and driving a 1991 Buick LeSabre that burned oil but never quit. The veterans' booth sat near the main stage, staffed by men who understood service without needing to explain it. Darius had volunteered because idle hands bred idle thoughts, and he'd had enough of both during his terminal leave. The afternoon had been routine until the sky opened up without warning, that sudden violence southern summers specialized in, sending festival-goers scattering like startled birds. Most people ran. One woman stood still, face tilted up to the rain as if daring it to do its worst. Mid-20s maybe, with dark hair plastered to her cheeks and a defiance in her posture that spoke to something deeper than getting wet. Darius grabbed his navy peacoat from under the table, old habits and all, and approached. "You planning to drown, standing up?" She turned, eyes bright with something between amusement and challenge. "You military?" The peacoat answered before he could. "Was. Navy lawyer, discharged last month." Her gaze swept him, cataloging and calculating. "Lawyer, you look too normal." The laugh came unbidden. "What do lawyers look like? Rich, pompous, white. I'm one of those things. The rest I'm working on." Her smile changed the geometry of her face, softened the edges. "Celeste Ashford, Darius Holloway." The handshake was firm, no nonsense, the kind exchanged between people who'd learned early that weakness was a luxury they couldn't afford. When the rain eased to a drizzle, they found themselves at a coffee shop 3 blocks away. The kind of place that served chicory dark enough to strip paint and never asked if you wanted room for cream. She was 28, working as a dental hygienist, saving every dollar that didn't go to rent and ramen. Her story spilled out in fragments between sips. Trailer parks in rural Georgia, food stamps stretched across weeks, a father who'd vanished when she was 6, and a mother who'd worked 3 jobs to keep the lights on. She'd clawed her way to a dental hygiene license, moved to Memphis for a fresh start, and spent her days cleaning teeth while dreaming of something larger than survival. Darius recognized the hunger. He'd grown up in a neighborhood where corner stores had bulletproof glass and ambition was measured in getting out rather than getting ahead. His own mother had worked double shifts at a textile factory, pressing dress shirts for men who'd never know her name, saving enough to help him through undergrad at Tennessee State before the Navy covered law school. They talked until the coffee shop closed at 3 a.m., comparing scars and strategies, finding unexpected common ground in the spaces between what they'd escaped and what they were building. When he walked her to her car, a Honda Civic with a cracked windshield, the air had cleared, stars visible despite the city's glow. "You gonna call me?" Direct, no games. He pulled out his phone, old Nokia that could survive a tactical strike. "What's the number?" 3 years unfolded in a sequence of decisions that felt inevitable only in retrospect. Darius passed the Georgia bar exam in the top 20%, landed a junior associate position at Peachtree Legal for $52,000 a year, more money than he'd ever seen in one place. Celeste kept her dental hygiene job in Memphis initially, but the commute between cities wore thin after 6 months. She transferred to an Atlanta practice, $41,000 annually, and they rented a one-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood gentrification hadn't discovered yet. Combined income of $93,000 felt like wealth after years of counting pennies. They split expenses down the middle, saved aggressively, and built something that resembled a future. Darius worked 70-hour weeks, taking every case the senior partners wanted to dump, learning the law through immersion rather than theory. Celeste managed their finances with the precision of someone who'd seen poverty's other side and refused to visit again. June 2001, Atlanta Courthouse, $1,200 total cost, including Celeste's dress from a consignment shop and the lunch afterward at a barbecue joint that didn't take reservations. Mama Holloway had cried, happy tears, the kind that spoke to relief and hope in equal measure. She'd pulled Darius aside while Celeste chatted with cousins. "Baby, you found a good woman. Don't take her for granted." The words had weight, the kind that comes from a woman who'd been taken for granted herself. "Never, Mama." And for years he hadn't. The first decade of marriage carried the momentum of shared purpose. They were building together, partners in the truest sense, and the work demanded everything they had. Darius made junior partner in 2003, salary jumping to $110,000. Celeste kept working, kept contributing, kept the books balanced to the penny. 2007 arrived with recession warnings that most people ignored and a growing restlessness in Darius that he couldn't quite articulate. The firm was solid, stable, but something in him wanted more, not money for its own sake, but the autonomy that came with building rather than maintaining. He opened Holloway Legal Consulting in a rented office the size of a generous closet, one paralegal who worked part-time, and a client list consisting of exactly nobody. Celeste had been skeptical but supportive, the kind of support that came with spreadsheets and projections and a clear understanding that failure meant returning to jobs they'd rather not discuss. The first year brought in $47,000 in billings, barely enough to cover overhead. The second year, $63,000. By year 3, Darius had landed a corporate client, mid-sized manufacturer with contract disputes that needed untangling, and billings hit $200,000. The turning point came in 2009, recession in full swing when most lawyers were scrambling for work. Darius took a gamble on a case other firms had turned down, wrongful termination suit against a Fortune 500 company with deep pockets and deeper legal teams. The case was complex, the odds long, but the principle mattered more than the payoff. 18 months of 16-hour days, depositions that filled bankers' boxes, and a trial that stretched 3 weeks. The jury deliberated for 6 hours and came back with a verdict that made the front page of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. $8.7 million in damages plus legal fees. Darius's cut, after expenses and the client's share, came to just under $900,000. More money than his mother had earned in her entire working life. He'd called Celeste from the courthouse steps, hands shaking with adrenaline and disbelief. Her scream of joy had been genuine, pure, untainted by anything except shared victory. That night they'd celebrated with cheap champagne in their modest house, purchased in 2004 for $180,000, still carrying a mortgage that made Darius wince, and made plans that felt boundless. By 2010, Holloway Legal Consulting had become Holloway Legal Services. 3 attorneys on staff, revenue of $1.2 million. By 2012, $8 million. By 2015, $28 million. The growth was exponential, fueled by corporate clients who valued discretion and competence over pedigree, and Darius delivered both without apology. Celeste had quit dental work in 2006, taking over the firm's office management when it was still small enough for one person to handle. She'd been good at it, organized, efficient, with a head for numbers that kept the books clean and the cash flow positive. But as the firm expanded, as Darius hired professional administrators and accountants and HR directors, her role became vestigial, a courtesy rather than a necessity. 2017 brought the rebranding to Holloway Garrett Legal Group after Lionel Garrett joined as senior partner, bringing his own book of business worth $40 million annually. Revenue hit $85 million that year, and the firm moved to offices on the 43rd floor of a building that made their old space look like a storage unit. Somewhere in the expansion, in the endless negotiations and depositions and strategy sessions that bled into weekends and holidays, the marriage became something else. Not broken exactly, but shifted, the foundation settling into configurations neither had anticipated. Darius worked 70-hour weeks because the work demanded it, because growth required constant feeding, because stepping away meant losing ground to competitors who never slept. Celeste found herself with time and money but no clear purpose. The role she'd carved out as office manager obsolete, the partnership she'd valued reduced to being the wife of a successful man rather than a partner in success. The distance grew in increments. Missed dinners, abbreviated conversations, sex that happened on a schedule rather than spontaneously, until they were sharing a house without sharing a life. The first crack showed in July 2016 family reunion in Memphis. Cousins and uncles gathered at Mama Holloway's house for a celebration that involved too much food and too little space. Darius's cousin Marcus, who'd done well in real estate, clapped him on the back with genuine affection. "Man, heard you got that fancy firm now, doing real good." Darius deflected, the way he always did when family brought up money, the discomfort of success among people still struggling too sharp to ignore. "It's growing, taking care of folks." Celeste's voice cut across the conversation, sharp edges wrapped in honey. "Taking care of everyone but home." The yard went quiet in that way that happens when someone says the thing everyone's thinking but nobody wanted to voice. Marcus found somewhere else to be. Darius focused on his plate, brisket suddenly tasteless. Later, Mama pulled Celeste aside in the kitchen, hands gentle on her shoulder. "Baby, what's going on?" The answer came with tears Celeste hadn't meant to shed. "He's never home, Mama H. I'm just furniture now." Mama's wisdom carried the weight of 42 years married to a man who'd worked himself into an early grave. Marriage takes work from both sides. I did my work, 15 years. What's my reward? The question hung unanswered because there wasn't a good answer. Just the reality that life rarely distributed rewards according to effort, and resentment was easier to cultivate than gratitude. November 2017 brought the firm gala. 200 guests packed into the Ritz-Carlton ballroom, the kind of event where judges mingled with CEOs, and everyone pretended the networking wasn't nakedly transactional. Darius gave a speech thanking everyone who'd contributed to the firm's success, saving Celeste for last. "None of this exists without her. She believed when I had nothing." The applause was generous, expected. Celeste smiled the way you smile when a camera's pointed at you. And later, when a judge asked what she did, her response came with acid. I exist in his shadow." The judge had excused himself with practiced grace, but Darius caught the exchange, the contempt barely masked, and something in him went cold. Not angry. Anger would have been easier. Just aware that they'd crossed a line neither had acknowledged existed until it was behind them. His 55th birthday arrived in January 2023. With a party Celeste organized, expensive and public, held at a penthouse venue overlooking Atlanta's skyline. The guest list was corporate and political, the kind of people who measured relationships in utility. And Darius had smiled through it because refusing would have caused more problems than enduring. Celeste's toast carried the weight of years, each word carefully chosen for maximum impact with minimum overt hostility. To Darius, the man who built an empire but forgot to build a marriage. The room went silent in the way that happens when social conventions collide with uncomfortable truth. Darius raised his glass because what else could he do, and later when Lionel pulled him aside near the bar, the concern was genuine. "Brother, something's wrong." The denial came automatic, a reflex honed over years of maintaining appearances. "She's just stressed." But Lionel's eyes said he knew better, and Darius knew he knew, and the pretense felt more exhausting than the truth. Spring 2019 brought changes neither discussed directly. Celeste joined Midtown Athletic Club, expensive but worth it for the amenities and the sense of doing something rather than simply existing. The personal trainer assigned to her initial session was Trent Calloway, 34, former University of Georgia linebacker who'd blown out his knee junior year and pivoted to fitness when the NFL dream died. He was handsome in the way that came easy to men who'd spent their lives in weight rooms, all sharp angles and easy charm, and his attention felt like water after drought. The compliments started casual, good form, natural athleticism, dedication paying off, but the subtext was clear to anyone who'd forgotten what it felt like to be seen. 6 months of training sessions became coffee afterward, became conversations that stretched into hours, became emotional intimacy that preceded physical by design rather than accident. Celeste mentioned her husband in passing, always vaguely painting a picture of neglect that wasn't entirely false but wasn't entirely true either. Trent played his part well, sympathetic without pushing, attentive without demanding, and when the first kiss happened in August 2019 in the private training room after hours, it felt inevitable rather than chosen. The affair that followed was methodical. Hotels during the day, his apartment when Darius traveled, careful and calculated to minimize risk while maximizing the validation Celeste craved. The money started flowing in November, Celeste asking for $20,000 to help Trent expand his training business. Darius hesitated, not because of the amount, but because something about the request felt off. A note that didn't quite harmonize, but Celeste framed it as supporting someone trying to build something, and Darius understood that instinct better than most. The transfer went through. The business never materialized. March 2020 brought another request, $15,000 for equipment, June $30,000 for a lease deposit, December $18,000 for marketing. Each time, Darius felt the dissonance grow louder, but each time he authorized the transfer because saying no would require confronting questions he didn't want to answer. By the end of 2023, $127,000 had moved from joint accounts to Trent Calloway's personal banking, and Yvette Moreau, the firm's forensic accountant, meticulous and unafraid of difficult conversations, had flagged the pattern. These are significant transfers to a third party. Darius stared at the spreadsheet, each line item a small betrayal that accumulated into something larger. "She's supporting a friend, it's fine." Yvette's expression said she hoped he was right, but doubted it, and she was right to doubt. May 2022 brought the firm's 20th anniversary gala. 400 guests in a venue that cost more than Darius's first year of law school, and his speech thanked everyone from the paralegal who'd been there since day one to the clients who'd taken chances on a black lawyer from Memphis who'd had nothing but hunger and competence to offer. He saved Celeste for the end the way he always did, because publicly acknowledging her felt like the minimum owed after years of private distance. None of this exists without her. She believed when I had nothing. The applause was generous, perfunctory, and at her table, surrounded by wives of partners and clients, Celeste leaned toward Sloane, her closest friend, or what passed for one, and her voice carried just far enough. He had nothing? He still has nothing where it matters. Sloane's shock was visible, quickly masked, but the damage was done. By morning, the comment had made its way back to Darius through the informal network of whispers that govern social hierarchies, and he understood with sudden clarity that whatever remained of their marriage was already dead, just waiting for someone to declare time of death. September 2022 brought the funeral that made everything else feel trivial by comparison. Mama Holloway passed after a 6-month fight with pancreatic cancer, the kind that moved fast and showed no mercy, and Darius sat beside her hospital bed during those final weeks, holding her hand while she drifted in and out of consciousness shaped by morphine and acceptance. Near the end, during one of her lucid moments, she'd gripped his hand with surprising strength. "Baby, you okay?" The lie came automatic. "I'm fine, Mama." Her eyes saw through him the way they always had. "Don't let bitterness make you cruel. Whatever comes, keep your dignity." Those were among her last coherent words, and Darius carried them to the funeral, where 300 people came to pay respects to a woman who'd pressed shirts for 50 years and raised a son who'd exceeded every expectation. Celeste stood beside him through the service, texting throughout. And when his cousin noticed and mentioned it later with barely concealed disgust, Darius had made excuses. She grieves differently. But they both knew it was a lie. January 2023 brought his 55th birthday and Celeste's toast, and the growing awareness that they were performing marriage rather than living it. April brought the crisis that would accelerate everything. A former client filing a malpractice suit for $8 million. Claims that were false but would cost millions to defend. An insurance that would cover $5 million but leave $3 million exposed. The firm's cash flow tightened overnight. Legal fees for defense mounting daily, and Darius called a meeting to discuss temporary cost reductions. Celeste was there, listening, and afterward in their Buckhead estate worth $3.2 million with views that justified the mortgage, he'd tried to explain. "Babe, we need to pause discretionary spending for 6 months. The legal fight's going to be expensive." Her response came with accumulated fury, years of resentment finding outlet in a single explosion. "Pause? I've been on pause for 20 years waiting for your attention." He tried to de-escalate, to explain that the firm's survival mattered to both of them, but Celeste was past hearing. "This is serious. The firm could— the firm, what about me?" The conversation ended without resolution, and 1 week later the credit card statement showed a $45,000 charge from Cartier. Darius stared at it in his office, door closed, the weight of betrayal settling like concrete in his chest. He called her that evening, voice carefully neutral. "I asked you to hold off on large purchases. My money too, I've earned it." The claim hung between them, technically true, community property and all, but fundamentally dishonest. "By doing what? You haven't worked in 15 years. The silence stretched before Celeste's response came, venomous and precise. "I stood by you when you were nobody." The accuracy of the accusation didn't make it less cruel, and Darius ended the call without responding, the kind of silence that spoke louder than words. That night, alone in his office with Atlanta's lights spread below like a circuit board, he made the call he'd been avoiding for months. "Octavio Reyes Investigations." The voice was professional, no nonsense, exactly what Darius needed. I need to know if my wife is cheating, and I need to know where my money went. Octavio Reyes had spent 20 years with the FBI before retiring to private work. The kind of investigator who understood that truth was rarely comfortable but always necessary. The retainer was $15,000, cheap at twice the price for what Darius needed. Certainty one way or another about whether his instincts were paranoia or perception. Give me 4 weeks. You'll have answers. The waiting was its own particular torture, maintaining normalcy while suspicion grew like mold in dark corners. Darius went to work, came home, shared space with Celeste without sharing much else, and wondered if this was what the rest of his life looked like. Performance without substance, obligation without affection. 3 weeks into the investigation, Octavio called with a preliminary report. You're going to want to see this in person. The office was nondescript, the kind of place that didn't advertise because it didn't need to, and Octavio's expression as Darius entered told him everything, before words became necessary. The first folder contained GPS tracking data, every location Celeste's car had visited over the past 3 weeks, plotted on maps with timestamps that told stories of their own. Midtown Athletic Club appeared frequently, expected and innocuous. But so did the Ritz-Carlton in Buckhead, the Westin in downtown, the Four Seasons in Midtown, always midday, always for 3 to 4 hours, always on days when Darius was in court or mediation or otherwise occupied. The second folder held photographs, surveillance from public spaces and hotel lobbies where security cameras documented everything. Celeste and Trent Calloway entering hotels separately but within minutes of each other. Celeste and Trent at coffee shops, his hand covering hers. Celeste and Trent in his apartment building's lobby, her body language speaking volumes about familiarity and comfort. The third folder was text messages extracted from phone records Darius had legal access to through their joint account. 412 messages over 18 months, escalating from friendly to intimate to explicit in a progression that felt like watching a slow-motion car crash. One message in particular burned itself into Darius's memory, sent in June 2023 while he'd been negotiating a settlement that would save the firm millions. Celeste to Trent, casual cruelty wrapped in practical planning. Prenup says 30% after divorce. Even if firm's worth $100 million, that's $30 million. We'll be set. Trent's response carried its own particular ugliness. When are you filing? Soon, once the lawsuit clears. Don't want him broke when I take my cut. Darius read the exchange 3 times, each reading failing to make it feel less real. 25 years of marriage reduced to financial calculation, and he was the asset being liquidated. Octavio waited until Darius looked up, patient and professional. There's more. Financial transfers totaling $127,000 over 3 years, all to Trent Calloway. Want me to keep digging? The answer should have been yes. Should have been the beginning of gathering every possible piece of evidence for the legal battle to come. Instead, Darius found himself asking a different question. Is there any possibility I'm wrong? Any chance this is innocent? Octavio's expression held something close to sympathy. Mr. Holloway, I've been doing this work for 30 years. What I showed you today isn't the worst I've seen, but it's clear. Your wife is having an affair, she's planning to divorce you for money, and she's been funding her affair partner with your joint accounts. I'm sorry. The apology didn't change anything, but it helped somehow. The acknowledgement that this was pain rather than paranoia. Darius thanked him, paid the balance owed, and drove home in silence, the evidence folders on his passenger seat like a passenger he couldn't ignore. That night, he sat in his home office, the one room that was his alone, with law books and photographs from cases won, and a window that overlooked the city he'd conquered professionally while losing ground personally, and made the call that would change everything. Lionel answered on the second ring, voice carrying concern sharpened by years of friendship that predated partnership. "Dee, it's midnight. What's wrong?" The words came easier than expected, probably because saying them out loud made them real in a way thinking them hadn't. "She's cheating, has been for years, and she's planning to divorce me for the money." Lionel's silence stretched before his response came, measured and careful. "You sure?" "I have 412 text messages, 3 years of financial records and surveillance footage. I'm sure." "What do you want to do?" The question hung in the air between them, and Darius understood that his answer would determine not just the next weeks, but potentially the next years. He could confront Celeste, demand explanation or apology or reconciliation. He could file for divorce immediately, strike first before she could organize. He could ignore everything, pretend the evidence didn't exist, and try to salvage something from the wreckage. Or he could do what he'd spent 30 years training for, build a case so airtight that when it finally came to light, there would be no room for doubt, no possibility of escape, no chance for her to spin narrative into anything resembling truth. "Start drafting the counter case. I want every legal option mapped out, but quietly. She can't know we know." Lionel's exhale carried recognition of what Darius was choosing. Not the quick resolution, but the methodical destruction. The kind that required patience and precision in equal measure. "This is going to get ugly, brother." "It's already ugly. I'm just making sure it's also fair." They ended the call, and Darius sat alone in the darkness, Atlanta's lights blurring through windows that needed cleaning, and felt something that wasn't quite relief but wasn't quite despair either. Clarity, maybe. Purpose. The understanding that the marriage was over had been over for longer than he'd wanted to admit, and what remained was simply the work of documentation and consequence. Mama's words came back to him, spoken in that hospital room weeks before the end. "Don't let bitterness make you cruel. Whatever comes, keep your dignity." He would try, but dignity and justice weren't mutually exclusive, and Celeste had made choices that demanded accounting. The rain outside had stopped, leaving Atlanta's streets slick and reflecting neon in patterns that shifted with every passing car. And Darius watched it all from his 43rd floor office, alone but not lonely, preparing for a war he hadn't wanted but would absolutely finish. The war room materialized over 3 days in September 2023. Lionel Garrett clearing out the small conference space on the 42nd floor that nobody used except for storage. 5 chairs arranged around a table that had seen better decades, whiteboards covering 2 walls and a security protocol that required biometric access because what they were building here couldn't leak. Darius arrived first on the morning of the 4th day, carrying coffee that had gone cold during the elevator ride, and a leather portfolio containing Octavio's complete findings. The weight of it felt symbolic, 25 years compressed into documentation that would fit in a briefcase. Lionel entered seconds later, followed by Yvette Moreau with her laptop and the expression of someone who'd spent the weekend reconstructing financial histories from fragments. Octavio came last, carrying boxes that suggested his investigation had expanded beyond the preliminary report. His handshake was firm, professional, the kind exchanged between people about to do difficult work together. "Gentlemen, ma'am, let's begin." The first hour focused on timeline reconstruction, building a narrative from data points that told their own story when properly sequenced. Yvette projected spreadsheets onto the whiteboard, each column representing a month, each row a different category of evidence. The pattern emerged like a photograph in developing fluid, slow at first, then undeniable. November 2019, first transfer to Trent Calloway, $20,000 with notation business loan in Celeste's handwriting on the check memo. Bank records showed the deposit went to Trent's personal account, not a business entity. March 2020, $15,000, memo reading equipment purchase. Yvette had cross-referenced that date with Georgia Secretary of State records. No business formation, no DBA filing, nothing suggesting legitimate commercial activity. She wasn't even trying to hide it. Yvette's finger traced the timeline, stopping at June 2020. 30,000 here, labeled lease deposit. I called the property management companies in Midtown where Trent operates. None have record of any deposit from him during that period. Darius absorbed this in silence, watching the numbers accumulate into something larger than individual transactions. $127,000 over 42 months worked out to just over $3,000 monthly. And the regularity suggested habit rather than emergency, pattern rather than exception. Lionel cleared his throat, legal pad already half filled with notes in handwriting that looked like organized chaos. Communications next. Octavio? The investigator opened his laptop, connecting to the room's display system with practiced efficiency. Text messages appeared in reverse chronological order, starting with the most recent and scrolling backward through 18 months of conversation that ranged from mundane to incriminating with dizzying speed. June 2023, Celeste to Trent at 2:17 in the afternoon. Lawyer says prenup is solid, 30% of marital assets based on firm valuation looking at $35 to $40 million. Trent's response came 4 minutes later. That's fuck you money. When? After this lawsuit clears, maybe October. Don't want him broke when I cash out. The words hung on the screen, each one a small detonation. Darius had read them before, multiple times, but seeing them projected 12 feet high in a conference room designed for legal strategy made them feel more real, less deniable. Lionel's pen scratched across paper, bullet points forming under headers that would eventually become legal arguments. Section 14 of the prenup, adultery clause. You drafted this intentionally broad, remember? The memory came sharp and clear. February 2018, sitting in this same building 3 floors up, Lionel pushing for prenup updates after the firm's valuation had crossed $100 million. Darius had resisted initially, the conversation feeling like planning for failure, but Lionel's logic had been sound. Protection wasn't pessimism, just prudence. They'd spent 2 weeks crafting language that balanced enforceability with comprehensiveness, consulting case law from Georgia and 6 other states, building a document that would survive challenge. Section 14 defined adultery broadly. Physical, emotional, financial infidelity all qualified, and the consequences were absolute. Forfeit all claims to assets, alimony, shared property. The only exception was if the aggrieved party chose to waive enforcement, putting control entirely in the hands of the faithful spouse. She signed it after her attorney reviewed. Darius's voice was flat, stating fact without inflection. I specifically told her to get independent counsel. She did. They spent 3 hours going over it before she signed. Yvette pulled up the signature page, notarized and witnessed. Celeste's attorney's stamp visible in the corner. Margaret Chen, family law specialist with 20 years' experience. Someone who absolutely would have flagged the adultery clause and explained its implications in detail. Celeste had signed anyway, either confident she'd never trigger it or convinced Darius would never enforce it. Both assumptions were proving fatal. Octavio advanced to the next evidence category, surveillance photographs organized by location and date. The Ritz-Carlton lobby, Celeste and Trent entering separately but within 8 minutes of each other. Timestamps proving coordination. The Weston's parking garage, Celeste's Mercedes beside Trent's Dodge Charger. Both vehicles registered and trackable. The Four Seasons, same pattern, different day. 37 hotel visits over 3 years. Octavio's finger tapped the screen. Always midday, always when Darius had court or depositions, she checked his calendar, planned around his schedule. The methodology stung more than the infidelity itself, the premeditation suggesting this wasn't passion overwhelming judgment, but calculation masquerading as romance. Lionel noticed Darius's expression, shifted topics with the grace of someone who'd been doing this dance for decades. Text messages are admissible. GPS data is admissible. Financial records are admissible. Photographs from public spaces are admissible. Everything here was obtained legally through joint account access or public surveillance. No wiretapping, no illegal entry, nothing a defense attorney can challenge on procedural grounds. The conversation turned technical, diving into Georgia evidence codes and federal privacy statutes, mapping out every possible objection Celeste's lawyer might raise and preemptively demolishing them. By noon, they'd built a legal framework solid enough to withstand assault from any direction. Lunch arrived courtesy of Lionel's assistant, sandwiches nobody touched, focus overriding appetite. Yvette returned to financial analysis, pulling up asset valuations that made the room go quiet in the way large numbers tend to do. Holloway Garrett Legal Group, current valuation based on revenue multiples and client retention $142 million. Darius owned 60%, Lionel 40%, making Darius's share worth $85 million. The Buckhead estate, purchased for $180 in 2004, now worth $3.2 million after renovations. Investment accounts, retirement funds, cash reserves. Everything accumulated over 25 years of work that had started with a Nokia phone and a dream of being more than circumstances allowed. Total marital assets, $94 million. Without the adultery clause, Celeste would be entitled to 30% under the prenup, $28.2 million plus alimony calculated at $25,000 monthly based on lifestyle maintenance. The numbers were staggering, the kind that transformed lives and funded generations. With the adultery clause triggered, 0. She gambled wrong. Yvette's assessment was clinical, mathematical, devoid of judgment or sympathy. Based on these texts, she thought the firm was worth maybe $100 million, estimated her share at $30 million, and planned her exit around maximizing that payout. She had no idea the actual numbers. Darius had wondered about that, about whether Celeste truly didn't know the firm's value or whether she'd deliberately avoided knowing, maintaining plausible deniability about just how much she was positioning to take. The texts suggested genuine ignorance. Her estimates were low by tens of millions, and if she'd known the real numbers, the timeline probably would have accelerated. We need to establish pattern and intent. Lionel was thinking like a trial lawyer now, building narrative from evidence. Show this wasn't a moment of weakness or a recent mistake, but sustained, planned betrayal over years. The financial transfers establish timeline, the text messages establish intent, the hotel visits establish pattern. Octavio added another layer, pulling up phone records that showed call frequency and duration. 1,847 calls between Celeste and Trent over 36 months. The data visualization was damning. Calls clustered during business hours when Darius was occupied. Duration averaging 23 minutes, pattern suggesting daily contact maintained with discipline. This is the part that destroys sympathy. Octavio's assessment carried the weight of someone who'd testified in court enough to know what moved juries. Affairs happen, people understand human weakness, but this level of planning, this sustained deception while actively taking money from joint accounts, that crosses into something else. The afternoon session focused on legal strategy, wargaming every possible scenario from Celeste's perspective and building counters. If she claimed emotional neglect, they had evidence of Darius's repeated attempts at counseling, date nights, vacations she'd rejected. If she claimed financial control, they had bank records showing she had full account access and spent without restriction. If she claimed the prenup was signed under duress, they had 3 hours of attorney consultation documented before her signature. Lionel mapped out the court timeline, assuming Celeste would file first once the firm's lawsuit resolved. Emergency hearing to freeze assets, discovery phase where they'd bury her in document requests, depositions where every lie would be locked in under oath, then trial where the evidence would speak for itself. She'll try to settle. Lionel's certainty came from experience. Once she sees what we have, her attorney will push hard for settlement, probably offering to walk away with nothing to avoid public exposure. The assumption sat heavy in the room, and Darius considered it. The clean exit, the quiet resolution, the opportunity to end this without turning their marriage into public spectacle. Mama's voice echoed in memory, counseling dignity over destruction. But another voice pushed back, asking whether dignity meant accepting betrayal without consequence. No settlement. This goes public. Lionel's pen stopped mid-word, and Yvette looked up from her laptop, both understanding the implications. Octavio nodded slightly, expression suggesting he'd expected this answer. You're sure? Once it's public, there's no walking it back. Your marriage becomes a case study, her affair becomes news, everyone in Atlanta's legal community will know the details. The certainty felt like bedrock, immovable and absolute. She chose public humiliation when she planned to file at my office. She told her friends I was an easy mark. She celebrated taking my money while I was fighting to save the firm. If this stays private, she learns nothing and does this to someone else. Public consequences are the only ones that matter. The decision shifted the room's energy, transformed this from legal defense into something more aggressive. Lionel started sketching out press strategy, how to control narrative without appearing vindictive, how to frame this as contract enforcement rather than revenge. Yvette calculated damages beyond the $127,000, adding interest and opportunity cost, building a restitution demand that would take years to satisfy. By late afternoon, the framework was complete, a legal strategy that would leave no room for Celeste to maneuver, no opportunity to spin narrative, no possibility of walking away with anything except debt and public exposure. The whiteboard filled with timelines and evidence categories and legal citations, a roadmap to consequences. Darius stood to leave as the September sun angled through windows, casting long shadows that made the room feel larger than it was. His team remained, refining details and building redundancy into every argument. But his part was done for now. The work ahead was theirs, investigators and accountants and lawyers doing what they did best. The drive home took 40 minutes. Atlanta traffic grinding to its usual evening paralysis, and Darius used the time to prepare mentally for what came next. Maintaining normalcy while building a case required compartmentalization, the ability to share space with someone you were systematically documenting for destruction. Celeste was in the kitchen when he arrived, preparing dinner with the efficiency of someone going through motions rather than investing attention. They'd maintained this routine for months, shared meals without shared conversation, proximity without intimacy, the performance of marriage absent its substance. How was your day? Her question was automatic, expected, requiring response but not elaboration. Productive. Depositions ran long. The lie came easy, justified by larger truths she'd been hiding for years. Yours? Gym, then lunch with Sloane. Nothing exciting. The casualness of it made something twist in Darius's chest. Not pain exactly, but recognition of how thoroughly she'd normalized betrayal, integrated it into daily routine until infidelity became unremarkable as grocery shopping. He wondered if she felt guilt, if the deception cost her anything, or if she'd rationalized it away into something justified by his absences and her loneliness. Dinner passed in silence, broken by occasional comments about food quality or weekend plans, surface-level exchanges that avoided anything requiring vulnerability. Darius watched her across the table, this woman he'd built a life with, and tried to remember when they'd stopped being partners and started being strangers who shared an address. After dinner, Celeste retreated to the master bedroom with her laptop and phone, the nightly routine that would involve texting Trent while Darius worked in his study. He'd read enough of their conversations to know the pattern. Declarations of missing each other, complaints about Darius's availability, plans for their next meeting. The predictability of it would have been boring if it weren't so destructive. His study felt like sanctuary, the one space that remained his alone, and Darius settled into the leather chair that had molded to his shape over years of late nights. The evidence files sat in his desk drawer, locked and password protected, a secret that grew heavier with each day of pretending ignorance. The phone rang near 11, Lionel's name on the screen. His partner's voice carried exhaustion sharpened by discovery. Found something in the deep dive. Trent Calloway filed for business licenses 3 times in the past 4 years. Never followed through, never actually operated, just filed paperwork to make it look legitimate when asking for money. The information wasn't surprising. Grifters rarely stopped at one score, but it added another layer to the prosecution case. Fraud, systematic and repeated, targeting Celeste, who was simultaneously targeting Darius. The poetry of it almost made him smile. Good work, add it to the evidence file. D, you sleeping okay? This kind of stress, it compounds. The concern was genuine, friendship transcending business, and Darius appreciated it even as he deflected. I'll sleep fine once this is over. October arrived with temperature drops that made Atlanta remember it was technically autumn, and Celeste's behavior shifted in ways subtle enough that someone not watching closely might miss. Phone calls taken in other rooms, laptop screen angled away when Darius entered, credit card statements she collected from the mail before he could see them. The pattern suggested acceleration, plans entering final stages. Octavio confirmed it with surveillance logs showing increased meeting frequency. 3 times weekly now instead of twice, hotels giving way to Trent's apartment, the kind of shift that suggested confidence or carelessness or both. Text messages supported the timeline, Celeste mentioning December dates, asking about Darius's trial calendar, coordinating her filing around his professional commitments in ways that would maximize impact. Yvette discovered additional transfers, 44,000 over the past 18 months in smaller increments, 500 here, 2,000 there, carefully structured to avoid triggering automatic alerts. The pattern suggested Celeste had learned from the larger transfers, adapted her strategy, but she hadn't counted on a forensic accountant with FBI training reconstructing transactions from metadata. By November, Darius had everything he needed. Evidence so comprehensive that defense became impossible, documentation so thorough that doubt became untenable. Lionel drafted the counter-petition, 487 pages of legal argument, evidence exhibits, and asset protection motions that would tie Celeste's attorneys in knots for months. The firm's lawsuit resolved in late November, the plaintiff dropping claims after depositions revealed their case was built on fabrications. The settlement cost nothing, and the firm's insurance covered legal fees, which meant the temporary financial pressure that had tightened cash flow evaporated overnight. Celeste noticed, mentioned it casually over breakfast that felt like theater. Heard the lawsuit settled, that's good news. Darius agreed, watching her calculate behind eyes that revealed nothing. Knowing she was adjusting her timeline based on his improved financial position. The predatory nature of it would have been impressive if it weren't so personal. December 15th arrived cold and clear, the kind of winter morning that made Atlanta's traffic slightly less terrible because everyone moved with purpose toward warm destinations. Darius was in depositions downtown, extracting testimony from a corporate executive who'd made the mistake of lying in previous statements when his assistant texted with an image attachment. Process server at the office, documents being delivered. The photograph showed a man in a cheap suit holding an envelope, and Darius knew without opening it what the contents would be. Celeste had filed, chosen his workplace for maximum public impact, timed it to coincide with a partner meeting where 15 attorneys would witness the humiliation. He excused himself from the deposition, citing emergency, and made the drive to Buckhead in 23 minutes that should have taken 40. The conference room still held stragglers from the meeting, partners who'd seen the process server and were now trying to pretend they hadn't noticed. Darius thanked them for their discretion and closed his office door and an envelope unopened on his desk. The petition ran 37 pages, professionally drafted by Winston Kraft, expensive attorney with a reputation for aggressive divorce litigation and settlements that favored women. The demands were comprehensive: 30% of marital assets based on Prenup Section 7, alimony of $25,000 monthly, the Buckhead estate, legal fees, and a motion to freeze Darius's accounts pending asset division. Celeste had calculated her share at $38 million based on what she thought the firm was worth, apparently unaware the actual numbers were higher. The petition painted Darius as emotionally absent, professionally obsessed, and financially controlling. None of it technically false, but all of it framed to minimize her own choices while maximizing his faults. Lionel entered without knocking, face carrying the particular satisfaction of someone who'd been waiting for this moment. His hand held a document of his own, considerably thicker than Celeste's petition. Her attorney will receive this in about 3 hours. Gives us time to call a press contact, frame the narrative before she can spin it. The counter-petition was a masterpiece of legal warfare. 487 pages documenting every hotel visit, every text message, every dollar transferred to Trent Calloway over 3 years. Section 14 enforcement fraud charges, restitution demands for $127,000 plus interest, and a motion for full cost recovery including legal fees. Darius read it twice, checking details against memory, and found no errors. His signature went on the final page, notarized by Lionel's assistant who'd been standing by, and the machine was in motion. She'll know by 6 tonight. Her attorney will call, try to negotiate. You want me to handle it? The answer required no thought. Tell them we're prepared for trial. No settlement discussions until discovery is complete. 3 hours later, Darius's phone rang with Celeste's number. He considered not answering, letting it go to voicemail, but curiosity won. Her voice when he picked up carried panic barely contained. "What the fuck did you do?" The profanity was unusual. Celeste prided herself on composure, which meant her attorney had already explained the implications of Section 14 and shown her the evidence. Darius kept his own voice level, professional, the tone he used for opposing counsel rather than his wife. "I filed a response to your petition, standard procedure." "Standard? You're accusing me of—" She stopped, awareness dawning that this conversation was probably being recorded, anything she said potentially used against her. "We need to talk in person, without lawyers." The request was strategic, attempt to negotiate before her attorney could stop her. But Darius had spent too long building this case to compromise now. Any communication goes through counsel. You have Kraft, I have Lionel. They can coordinate. "Darius, please, we can work this out." The pleading in her voice might have moved him 6 months ago, before he'd read text messages planning his financial destruction, before surveillance photos proved systematic betrayal. Now it just sounded like someone realizing the trap had closed and desperately seeking exit. "You made choices, Celeste. I'm just enforcing consequences. Your attorney has my attorney's contact information." He ended the call before she could respond, and the silence afterward felt like victory. Small, preliminary, but real. Lionel texted confirmation that Winston Kraft had called, sputtering about scorched earth tactics and disproportionate response, demanding immediate settlement discussions. Lionel's response had been professional and final. "Discovery first, then we'll consider whether there's anything to discuss." The news cycle caught it by mid-January. Business reporter who covered legal industry filing a piece about prominent attorney's divorce involving fraud allegations and prenup enforcement. The article was factual, careful to avoid defamation while making clear the basic outline. Wealthy lawyer's wife allegedly conducted affair, planned divorce to access assets, triggered prenup clause that voided her claims. Atlanta's legal community knew both names, connected dots, and gossip spread through networks that thrived on scandal. Celeste's friends began distancing, social invitations drying up. The kind of social death that happened fast in circles that valued reputation over loyalty. Trent Calloway received a subpoena in late January, compelling testimony about his relationship with Celeste and the $127,000. His initial response, relayed through a public defender who clearly wanted no part of this case, was refusal. Lionel filed a motion to compel. Judge granted it within 48 hours, and Trent found himself facing contempt charges if he failed to appear. The deposition happened in early February, small conference room with court reporter and video recording. Trent looking like someone who'd wandered into a nightmare and couldn't find the exit. Lionel handled questioning with surgical precision, establishing timeline, confirming receipt of money, documenting the affair without explicit details but with enough specificity to make denial impossible. How long was your romantic relationship with Mrs. Holloway? Trent shifted in his chair, eyes darting to the public defender who could only shrug. About 4 years. Did you know she was married? Yes. Did she promise you money after divorcing her husband? Pause. Calculation visible behind eyes that understood perjury carried consequences. We discussed it. Did you receive $127,000 from her over 3 years? Over time, yeah. Did you repay any of it? No. Did you establish a business with any of that money? I tried, but things didn't work out. The lie was casual, unsupported by documentation, and Lionel let it hang there on the record before moving to the next question. By the end of 2 hours, Trent had confirmed everything Darius needed, locked himself into testimony he couldn't later contradict, and looked like he regretted every decision that had led to this room. Celeste's own deposition came in March, delayed by her attorney's attempts to negotiate conditions and limit scope, finally ordered by the judge who was losing patience with obstructive tactics. She appeared looking diminished somehow, the confidence of December replaced by awareness that this wasn't proceeding according to plan. Lionel's questions were relentless but professional, building a record that would be admissible at trial, forcing Celeste to choose between perjury and admission with every answer. The hotel visits, did they occur? Yes. The text messages, were they hers? Yes, though she tried claiming context, explanations that sounded hollow when read against documented timeline. The money transfers, did she request them? Yes, but for legitimate business purposes that had simply failed to materialize. Did you read Section 14 of the prenuptial agreement before signing? My attorney explained it. So you understood that adultery would void your claims to assets? I didn't think it would come to this. The admission hung in the room, and Lionel moved smoothly to the next question, building a record of knowledge and intent that would survive any challenge. By the time the deposition ended 6 hours later, Celeste had confirmed every material fact Darius needed, her own words creating the evidence chain that would destroy her claims. April brought settlement overtures, Winston Kraft calling Lionel with increasing desperation, offering concessions that revealed how thoroughly they understood their position. Celeste would walk away with nothing, waive all claims if Darius would agree to keep the evidence file sealed, avoid public trial, let this end quietly. Lionel relayed the offer, and Darius considered it, the easy path, the dignified exit Mama would have counseled. But public consequence was the point, the lesson that needed teaching, and private settlement would turn betrayal into something negotiable rather than unacceptable. Trial proceeds as scheduled. The court date was set for early May, judge having expedited the calendar after reviewing evidence and determining this wouldn't require lengthy proceedings. 5 days blocked, though everyone involved knew it would end sooner once the evidence started mounting. Darius used the month to prepare mentally, reviewing testimony and evidence until he could recite details from memory, ready for cross-examination that would never actually challenge facts, but might try to attack motivation. Lionel coached him on demeanor. Calm, factual, more disappointed than angry, let the evidence speak rather than editorializing. The night before trial, Darius sat in his study with wedding photos spread across the desk. Images of two people who'd believed partnership meant something permanent, who'd built dreams on foundations that seemed solid until tested. Celeste at 28, bright-eyed and determined, no hint yet of what she'd become. Darius at 30, earnest and optimistic, trusting in ways he'd never be again. The phone rang near midnight, Celeste's number, and this time he didn't answer. Her voicemail was brief, voice carrying desperation he'd never heard before. "Darius, please, we can still fix this. I made mistakes, but we can work through them. Don't do this tomorrow, please." He deleted it without responding, the plea too late and too calculated to move him. Tomorrow wasn't about reconciliation or forgiveness. It was about consequence delivered through legal system, justice made public, and a marriage receiving the ending its final years had earned. Sleep came eventually, dreamless and deep, and when Darius woke at 6 to Atlanta sunrise painting his bedroom gold, he felt something close to peace, not happiness but clarity. The certainty that comes from knowing you've built your case correctly and truth will speak for itself. The trial would begin in 4 hours, and he was ready. Fulton County Family Court occupied the 7th floor of a building that had seen Atlanta transform from the city Sherman burned to the metropolis that hosted the world, and the courtroom itself carried that history in wood paneling gone dark with age and acoustics that made whispers carry like accusations. Judge Marianne Foster's bench sat elevated enough to require looking up, symbolic and practical. Her reputation for no-nonsense proceedings preceding her into chambers where attorneys prepared their wars. Darius arrived at 8:40, 20 minutes before the 9 o'clock call, wearing a charcoal suit that cost less than he could afford. Because appearing wealthy felt like tactical error when the case centered on money. Lionel walked beside him carrying the litigation bag that held copies of everything. Evidence binders organized by category, witness lists cross-referenced with exhibits. Legal precedents flagged for quick reference. Media had gathered outside despite the early hour, cameras tracking their approach with the hunger that came from a story combining wealth and betrayal and public consequence. A reporter Darius vaguely recognized from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution pushed forward with microphone extended. "Mr. Holloway, is it true your wife's infidelity cost you millions?" Lionel's hand on his elbow suggested silence, but Darius stopped anyway, meeting the camera with composure that came from decades of courtroom testimony. "The truth will present itself today. That's all I'll say." The answer was perfect. Implied wrongdoing without stating it, promised revelation without providing details, gave them a soundbite that wouldn't compromise legal strategy. They pushed through to security, metal detectors, and bag searches that treated everyone equally regardless of net worth, then elevators that climbed slowly enough to test patience. The courtroom was already filling, back rows with journalists and legal observers, middle section with colleagues from the firm who'd taken the morning off to witness, front rows empty except for court staff preparing exhibits and audio systems. Darius took his seat at the petitioner's table, technically respondent since Celeste had filed first, but his counter-petition had shifted dynamics enough that labels felt arbitrary. Celeste entered at 8:57, Winston Kraft beside her looking like a man who knew he'd lost before starting but was contractually obligated to fight anyway. She'd dressed carefully, navy suit conservative enough to suggest respectability without appearing expensive, minimal jewelry, hair pulled back in a style that said professional rather than wealthy. The performance was deliberate, attempt to control optics when substance had already escaped her grasp. Their eyes met across the courtroom's center aisle, and whatever Darius expected to feel, anger, satisfaction, residual affection, didn't materialize. Just emptiness, the recognition that they'd become strangers who happened to share legal entanglement and nothing more substantial. Judge Foster entered at 9 precisely, Bailiff's call of all rise unnecessary because everyone had already stood in anticipation. She was 63, African-American woman who'd spent 40 years in law before ascending to the bench, and her expression suggested she'd reviewed the case file thoroughly and reached conclusions about time wasting that didn't favor Celeste's position. We're here for Holloway versus Ashford, dissolution of marriage with contested asset division. I've reviewed both petitions and the evidence submissions. Mr. Kraft, your client filed first. Opening statement. Winston Kraft rose, legal pad in hand, and launched into an argument that would have been compelling if the evidence didn't exist. He painted Celeste as devoted wife, 25 years standing beside a man who valued career over marriage, who'd become emotionally unavailable as success mounted, who'd forced her into seeking connection elsewhere through his sustained neglect. Your Honor, my client made a mistake, yes, but that mistake came after years of loneliness, of being treated as accessory rather than partner, of watching the man she married disappear into his practice while she maintained the home they'd built together. The narrative had emotional resonance. Abandoned wife seeking comfort, finding it in wrong place, now facing disproportionate punishment for human weakness. If this had been a jury trial, if the evidence were circumstantial, Kraft might have found purchase. But Judge Foster's expression suggested she'd already read the text messages, seen the financial transfers, calculated the difference between mistake and methodology. Lionel's opening was surgical, stripping emotion away to reveal the architecture beneath. He established timeline, affair lasting 4 years, financial fraud totaling $171,000, including the additional transfers Yvette had discovered. Text messages proving premeditation rather than passion. Your Honor, this isn't a case about marriage counseling or who failed whom emotionally. This is contract enforcement. Mrs. Ashford signed a prenuptial agreement after 3 hours of consultation with experienced family law counsel. She understood Section 14's adultery clause. She chose to violate it anyway while systematically transferring marital funds to her affair partner and planning divorce, specifically to maximize financial extraction. The evidence is comprehensive, the law is clear, and the outcome is predetermined by Mrs. Ashford's own choices. Judge Foster made notes, pen scratching across the legal pad that would eventually contain her ruling, then looked up with eyes that had seen every variation of human behavior courts could accommodate. Mr. Garrett, present your evidence. Let's not waste time with theatrics, just the facts. The first exhibit was the prenuptial agreement itself, projected onto screens positioned for optimal viewing. Section 14 highlighted in yellow that made the text impossible to miss. Lionel walked the judge through drafting history. Consultation with Celeste's attorney documented in billing records. 3-hour meeting where every clause was explained. Signature page with notarization proving she'd signed with full knowledge and counsel. Your Honor, I'd like to call Margaret Chen, Mrs. Ashford's prenuptial attorney, to establish that Section 14 was explicitly discussed. Celeste's face went pale as Margaret Chen entered, sworn in, took the witness chair with the reluctance of someone who'd rather be anywhere else. Chen was mid-50s, family law specialist with impeccable reputation, and her testimony was damning in its precision. Did you review the prenuptial agreement with Mrs. Ashford in February 2018? Yes, for approximately 3 hours. Did you specifically discuss Section 14, the adultery clause? I did. I explained it meant any extramarital relationship, physical, emotional, or financial, would void her claims to assets, alimony, and shared property. Did Mrs. Ashford understand this explanation? She asked clarifying questions about what constituted adultery. I provided examples. She confirmed understanding before signing. Lionel thanked her, and Chen left quickly, clearly uncomfortable testifying against a former client, but bound by subpoena and professional ethics that prohibited perjury. Celeste whispered urgently to Winston Kraft, who could only shake his head. There was no cross-examination that would undo the damage of her own attorney confirming she'd signed with full knowledge. Exhibit B brought Yvette Moreau to the stand. Forensic accountant with credentials that filled 2 pages and experience that made her unimpeachable. The financial timeline appeared on screen, color-coded by transaction type, running from November 2019 through December 2023. Ms. Moreau, what did your analysis reveal? Yvette's presentation was methodical, walking through each transfer with bank statements as supporting documentation. 20,000 November 2019 notation business loan. Contradicted by Georgia Secretary of State records showing no business formation. 15,000 March 2020 equipment purchase unsupported by any invoice or delivery confirmation. The pattern repeated 42 times over 4 years, money flowing from joint accounts to Trent Calloway's personal banking. Total amount transferred, $171,400 plus accrued interest calculated at Georgia's legal rate brings the total to $189,320. The number hung in the courtroom air, specific enough to feel real, large enough to matter even to people who dealt with bigger figures regularly. Judge Foster made notes, expression unchanged, but the scratching of her pen suggested engagement with details. Winston Kraft's cross-examination attempted to establish the transfers as gifts rather than fraud. Marital funds used at Celeste's discretion for purposes she believed legitimate. Yvette demolished this calmly, walking through each notation's falsity, the business that never formed, the equipment never purchased, the lease never signed. So these notations were factually incorrect? Every single one, yes. Kraft sat down, having achieved nothing except confirming what the documents already proved, and Lionel moved to Exhibit C, the text messages that would eliminate any remaining doubt about intent. Octavio Reyes took the stand, former FBI investigator whose credentials included testimony in federal trials and expertise recognized across law enforcement. His explanation of how the messages were obtained, joint phone account, legal access, metadata preservation, maintaining chain of custody, preempted any challenge to admissibility. The first message appeared on screen, June 2023, Celeste to Trent. Prenup says 30% of marital assets. Lawyer thinks firm's worth $120 million. That's $36 million minimum. Gasps from the gallery, the first visible reaction to what had been clinical testimony until this moment. Judge Foster's expression hardened slightly, the shift from interested to engaged. Trent's response followed. When are you filing? After the lawsuit clears, October maybe. Want him solvent when I cash out. The calculation was stark, undeniable, the kind of premeditation that turned mistake into methodology. Lionel advanced through the messages chronologically, building pattern, discussions of asset division, planning around Darius's trial calendar, Trent asking about timeline with the impatience of someone waiting for promised payout. September 2023, Celeste to Trent. Talked to Kraft today. He thinks we can get 30% plus alimony, looking at $40 million total if firm valuation comes in high. The message established not just affair but conspiracy, the involvement of her attorney in planning financial extraction, though Winston Kraft's face suggested he hadn't been shown these particular texts when taking the case. Your Honor, I'd like to enter into evidence 378 additional messages of similar content, spanning June 2021 through December 2023. The complete file is available if the court wishes to review, but in the interest of time, I'll simply note that pattern remains consistent throughout. Sustained romantic relationship, detailed financial planning, explicit intent to divorce for monetary gain. Judge Foster nodded, making notes that filled another page. Winston Kraft rose for cross-examination, attempting to establish that private messages taken out of context didn't represent Celeste's true intentions, that the relationship had ended before filing, that planning finances wasn't the same as planning fraud. Octavio handled each question with professional detachment, pointing out that 412 messages over 30 months constituted pattern, not anomaly, that the final message was dated 3 days before Celeste filed, that discussing how to maximize asset extraction while conducting an affair qualified as fraud under Georgia law regardless of intent characterization. The morning session ended at 11:40. Judge Foster calling recess for lunch, suggesting they'd resume at 1:30 with remaining evidence. Darius left through the side exit, avoiding media, and found a diner 3 blocks away where nobody recognized him and the coffee was strong enough to qualify as ammunition. Lionel joined him, looking satisfied in the way litigators do when their case is proceeding exactly as built. His phone showed messages from colleagues who'd watched the morning session, all variations on the theme that Celeste's legal position was collapsing in real time. Kraft will try to settle during lunch. Want me to take the call? The answer was predetermined, decided months ago when strategy shifted from defense to consequence. Tell him we're seeing this through. Lunch arrived, club sandwich that Darius barely tasted, focus overriding appetite, and conversation drifted to what remained. Trent Calloway's testimony, the surveillance evidence, expert analysis of prenup enforceability, then closing arguments and ruling. Judge Foster could theoretically reserve decision, take time to review, but everything about her demeanor suggested she'd already reached conclusions and was simply ensuring the record was complete. The afternoon session began with Trent Calloway, subpoenaed and clearly wishing he'd chosen different hobbies than seducing married women whose husbands owned law firms. He'd dressed in a suit that didn't quite fit, testimony coached by the public defender who'd tried to get him out of appearing and failed spectacularly. Lionel's direct examination was brutal in its simplicity, establishing timeline and compensation without editorializing or inflection, letting facts create their own horror. How long was your romantic relationship with Mrs. Holloway? 4 years, approximately. Did you know she was married when it began? Yes. Did she discuss divorcing her husband? Trent shifted, eyes finding Celeste, who looked away. We talked about it. Did she tell you she would receive money from the divorce? She mentioned the prenup had provisions. Did you receive money from Mrs. Holloway during your relationship? She helped me with some business expenses. How much total? I don't know exactly, maybe 80,000? Lionel smiled, the expression of someone about to demolish a lie with documentation. He pulled up bank records showing every deposit, time-stamped and sourced, totaling $171,400. Mr. Calloway, you just testified under oath that you received maybe 80,000. These bank records show 171,400. Would you like to revise your testimony? The color drained from Trent's face, awareness dawning that perjury carried consequences and his casual lies were creating problems he hadn't anticipated. The public defender looked like he wanted to disappear. I might have underestimated. By $90,000? That's quite an estimation error. No response except silence, and Judge Foster intervened. Mr. Calloway, I suggest you answer accurately. This court takes perjury seriously. I received $171,000 over 4 years, yes. Did you repay any of it? No. Did you establish a business with those funds? I tried, but it didn't work out. You filed for business licenses 3 times in 4 years, but never actually operated a business, correct? Trent's eyes widened. He hadn't known anyone had checked, had assumed his lies would stand unchallenged. I filed paperwork, but never operated, never hired employees, never secured commercial space, never generated revenue. You simply filed paperwork to make it appear legitimate when requesting money from Mrs. Holloway. I had plans. Yes or no, Mr. Calloway? Did you operate a business? No. The admission hung in the air and Lionel moved smoothly to the next question, building a portrait of systematic fraud perpetrated against Celeste, who was simultaneously perpetrating fraud against Darius. a chain of betrayal that would have been darkly comic if the numbers weren't so substantial. Winston Kraft's cross-examination attempted damage control, suggesting Trent's mendacity didn't prove Celeste's, that she'd been victimized by someone she'd trusted, that her own transfers were based on believing his business claims. The argument had logic. She couldn't be responsible for Trent's lies, but it didn't address the text messages showing she'd planned divorce for money regardless of where that money ultimately went. The surveillance evidence came next, Octavio returning to walk through 37 hotel visits documented with photographs, timestamps, and GPS data. The presentation was clinical, devoid of sensationalism, just dates and locations and images of Celeste and Trent entering buildings separately but within minutes of each other. Judge Foster stopped him after the 12th hotel. "Mr. Reyes, I've seen sufficient evidence of the relationship. Let's move forward." The afternoon wore on, expert testimony about prenuptial enforceability under Georgia law, precedent cases where adultery clauses had been upheld, explanation of how the specific language in Section 14 made it essentially challenge-proof. By 4 o'clock, the evidence phase was complete, everything documented and admitted and preserved for appellate review if Celeste chose that futile path. Winston Kraft's closing argument was the effort of someone trying to build structure from rubble, appealing to Judge Foster's sense of proportionality and mercy. Yes, his client had erred, but 25 years of marriage deserved consideration beyond strict contract enforcement. Yes, she'd violated the prenup, but the punishment shouldn't be complete financial destruction for human weakness. Your Honor, I ask the court to consider modifying the enforcement of Section 14, allowing some asset distribution that recognizes Mrs. Ashford's contribution to the marriage, even if her recent behavior violated technical contract terms. It was a decent argument, would have worked with a different judge or different facts, but Judge Foster's expression suggested she'd already calculated the mathematics of consequence and found no room for modification. Lionel's closing was brief, unnecessary when evidence had spoken so thoroughly, but he delivered it anyway for the record. Contract law existed precisely for situations where emotion and equity conflicted with agreement, where courts had to enforce what parties had bargained for rather than what they wished they'd bargained for in hindsight. Mrs. Ashford signed this prenup with full legal counsel after extensive consultation. She understood the terms. She violated them systematically over 4 years, while actively planning to extract maximum financial benefit from divorce. The law is clear. When parties make agreements and violate them, courts enforce consequences. To do otherwise would render every contract negotiable after the fact based on regret, which would destroy the foundation of contract law itself. The arguments concluded at 4:30, and Judge Foster announced she would rule from the bench rather than taking the matter under advisement. The courtroom went silent, anticipation building, everyone understanding that the next words would either preserve or destroy Celeste's financial future. I've practiced law for 40 years before taking the bench, and I've presided over family court for 12 years since. I've seen marriages end for every conceivable reason, seen betrayals ranging from momentary weakness to calculated cruelty. What distinguishes this case is the comprehensive nature of the evidence and the clarity of the contractual language. Judge Foster looked directly at Celeste, expression carrying something between disappointment and resigned understanding. "Mrs. Ashford, you signed a prenuptial agreement with full legal representation. Your attorney testified you understood Section 14's adultery clause. You then conducted a 4-year affair while systematically transferring marital funds to your affair partner and explicitly planning divorce to maximize financial extraction. The text messages are unambiguous. You viewed this marriage as a financial transaction and your husband as an asset to be liquidated." Celeste's face crumbled, tears starting, but Judge Foster continued without pause. Mr. Holloway drafted that prenup to protect what he'd built through decades of work. He offered you partnership. You chose parasitism. He extended trust. You returned betrayal. The prenup exists precisely to address this scenario, and enforcing it isn't cruelty. It's consequence. The ruling came in measured phrases, each one a hammer blow to whatever hope Celeste had maintained. Divorce granted, prenuptial agreement enforced in full, zero asset distribution to Celeste. Zero alimony, restitution ordered for $189,320 representing fraud plus interest. Legal fees assessed at $94,000 based on Lionel's itemized billing. Total amount owed $283,320 payable over 24 months or subject to wage garnishment. The Buckhead estate remains Mr. Holloway's separate property, purchased prior to marriage and maintained through his income. Mrs. Ashford has 30 days to vacate. The gavel came down with finality that echoed off wood paneling, and the courtroom erupted in whispers that built to conversation as journalists rushed to file stories and colleagues absorbed the totality of Celeste's defeat. She sat motionless, Winston Kraft's hand on her shoulder offering comfort that couldn't change mathematics. Darius stood, Lionel beside him, and they walked toward the exit as media prepared questions. A reporter blocked their path, microphone extended, face eager with the hunger for sound bites. "Mr. Holloway, do you feel vindicated?" The question deserved consideration, but Darius provided only what was necessary. "I feel like justice was served. I spent 25 years building something through honest work. The law protected what I built. That's all this was. Contract enforcement." "Will you pursue criminal fraud charges against Mr. Calloway?" That option had been discussed, remained available, but felt like overreach given that Trent's primary crime was being opportunistic rather than criminal. "No comment at this time." They pushed through to elevators, descended to street level where more media waited, and Lionel ran interference while Darius made it to his car. The drive back to the office took him through Atlanta neighborhoods he'd known for decades, watching the city flow past windows with the detachment that came from emotional exhaustion. His phone buzzed with messages, colleagues congratulating him on the ruling, journalists requesting interviews, friends checking in with variations on concern and curiosity. He ignored them all, focusing on traffic and the mechanical actions of driving that required no emotional investment. The office was quiet when he arrived near 6, most attorneys gone home, support staff wrapping up their days. Darius took the elevator to 43, walked to his office with its windows overlooking Atlanta in late afternoon light, and closed the door on a day that had transformed legal theory into concrete reality. Lionel knocked 30 minutes later, entering with the trial bag that now felt lighter despite containing the same materials. His expression carried satisfaction tempered by awareness of what victory had cost. Kraft called. "Celeste wants to know if you'll negotiate on the restitution timeline." The answer required no deliberation. 24 months is ordered, not a day more. She's asking about the house, whether she can have 60 days instead of 30. Darius considered this, found no generosity left after 25 years of giving what was taken without gratitude. 30 days, she can move in with Trent until she figures it out. Lionel made notes, professional to the end, then set his pad aside. "How are you doing? Really?" The question invited vulnerability, and Darius found he had some to spare now that courtroom performance was complete. "I thought I'd feel better than this. Winning doesn't fix what's broken." Winning wasn't supposed to fix it, just enforce boundaries so she can't break anyone else the same way. The wisdom in that settled heavy. Reminder that public consequence served purposes beyond personal satisfaction. That making betrayal costly deterred future betrayal in ways private forgiveness never could. Silence falls without cost, but it teaches nothing except that silence is safe. and Darius had learned that lesson was the wrong one to pass forward. Lionel left near 7, promising to handle the administrative details, filing the judgment, coordinating title transfer on the Buckhead estate, setting up restitution payment structure. Darius remained at his desk as darkness claimed Atlanta outside his windows. City lights emerging like stars in patterns that suggested order even when chaos ruled. His phone rang near 9, Celeste's number appearing with the persistence of someone who hadn't accepted that certain conversations were finished. He answered because refusing felt like cowardice, and whatever else this day had taught him. He wasn't afraid of her anymore. Darius. Her voice carried devastation that might have moved him 6 months ago, before evidence had revealed calculation beneath every gesture. Please, we can still talk about this. The plea was familiar, variation on the theme she'd tried before, one more conversation to negotiate what contracts had already settled. One more chance to reduce consequence through appeal to history that she'd systematically destroyed. There's nothing left to discuss. The court ruled you have 30 days to move out. Where am I supposed to go? The question hung between them, and Darius recognized it for what it was. Attempt to make her problem his responsibility, to restore the dynamic where his resources solved her failures. But that relationship had ended the moment she'd texted Trent about maximizing financial extraction. That's not my concern anymore. You made choices. These are the results. Silence on her end, broken eventually by the sound that might have been crying or might have been rage suppressed. When she spoke again, the tone had shifted from pleading to accusatory. You set me up. The whole prenup was a trap. The accusation was accurate but irrelevant. I gave you a contract that protected us both if we stayed faithful and destroyed whoever didn't. You gambled I wouldn't enforce it. You lost. I loved you. Past tense. Notable and sad, but he'd stopped believing her definitions of love matched any he recognized. You loved what you thought you could take. The difference matters. He ended the call before she could respond, and the silence afterward felt like closure. Incomplete and imperfect, but real. 25 years had ended not with reconciliation or understanding, but with legal judgment and financial consequence and the recognition that some marriages didn't deserve saving, just honest accounting of how they died. Darius stayed late in his office, reviewing what tomorrow would bring. Administrative tasks, media management, the slow work of extracting himself from the entanglement that marriage created in property and habit and memory. Celeste would move out within 30 days, probably to Trent's apartment if their relationship survived the public exposure and financial reality that neither had money worth exploiting anymore. The firm would continue thriving, cases won and clients served and revenue compounding. The work that had consumed those 25 years now standing as the only lasting product of time invested. He'd built something real while she'd built fantasies of extraction, and the law had recognized which deserved protection. Atlanta's lights blurred through windows that probably needed cleaning, and Darius wondered what came next for a man 56 years old with money and success, and no one to share it with who wouldn't measure sharing in spreadsheets and prenup clauses. The question felt larger than he had energy to answer, so he filed it away for tomorrow or next week or whenever the numbness wore off enough to feel possibility again. For now, justice had been served, consequences delivered, and truth made public in ways that would echo through Atlanta's legal community for years. Wives planning divorce would remember Celeste's fate. Husbands would cite this case when drafting prenups, and maybe, just maybe, someone would think twice before treating marriage as financial transaction and discovering too late that contracts cut both ways. The silence isn't weakness after all. Just patience gathering evidence for the moment when speaking finally matters. And when that moment comes, when truth emerges from shadow into courtroom light, the accounting is absolute and the reckoning complete. Darius turned off his office lights near midnight, descended to the parking garage, and drove home to a house that would be his alone in 30 days, carrying victory that felt more like exhaustion, and the knowledge that winning sometimes just means you're the last one standing when the destruction ends.